There are crimes that shock a nation, and then there are crimes that make an entire country stop and ask a question it doesn't want to answer. Not who did it. They knew who did it almost immediately. The question was, how? How does a 16-year-old girl get murdered inside her own home? By someone who ate at the same table, watched the same television, walked the same hallways, and nobody saw it coming. How does a family sit down for dinner and not know that the person passing the salt is capable of something so monstrous that even seasoned detectives would struggle to find the words for it? That is the question at the heart of the Rebecca Watts case, and it is a question that even now, even with a conviction and a sentence and a file that has been officially closed, has never been fully answered. Her name was Rebecca Watts. She was 16 years old. She lived in Bristol, England, in a house that should have been the safest place in the world for her. And on a quiet February morning in 2015, she walked out of her bedroom and was never seen alive again. If you're new here, subscribe. We cover cases like this one every single week. Cases that get under your skin and stay there. Now, let's talk about who Rebecca Watts really was. Rebecca Watts was born in 1998 in Bristol, a city in the southwest of England that sits along the River Avon, full of Victorian terraces and steep hills, and the kind of working-class neighbourhoods where everybody knows everybody, where front doors are left unlocked and children grow up on the same streets their parents grew up on. She was the daughter of Darren Watts. Quiet, by most accounts, thoughtful, the kind of teenager who kept to herself, who had a small circle of friends she was deeply loyal to, who loved social media the way teenagers do, not as performance, but as connection. She posted selfies. She messaged her friends. She documented the small, ordinary moments of being 16 in the way that 16-year-olds do, with no idea that those ordinary moments are worth documenting. With no idea that one day they would be the last record anyone had of her alive. Her father Darren had remarried. His new wife was a woman named Angie, warm, well-liked in the neighborhood, devoted to her children. Angie had a son from a previous relationship. His name was Nathan Matthews. He was 28 years old. He lived nearby with his girlfriend, Shauna Hoare. On the surface, it was a blended family doing what blended families do, navigating the complicated geometry of step-parents and step-siblings, of holidays and shared spaces, and the particular awkwardness of being related to people you didn't choose. It wasn't perfect, what family is, but it functioned. It held together. Nobody who knew them, not the neighbors, not the friends, not the extended family, saw what was coming. And what was coming was so far outside the boundaries of what ordinary people imagine is possible that perhaps that's not surprising. Perhaps the most disturbing things are always the ones that arrive without warning. On the morning of February 19, 2015, Rebecca Watts left her bedroom. It was a Thursday, an ordinary Thursday, the kind of day that doesn't announce itself as significant, that arrives and passes like every other day unless something happens to mark it permanently in the memory. Something happened. By that evening, Rebecca hadn't come home. Her family reported her missing. Police began an initial inquiry. A missing teenager, not yet cause for serious alarm, the kind of report that comes in regularly and usually resolves itself within hours. A teenager staying at a friend's house. A teenager who lost track of time. A teenager who needed space and took it without telling anyone. But Rebecca Watts was not that kind of teenager. She was not impulsive. She was not the type to disappear without a word. The people who knew her said so immediately and consistently. This was not like her. Something was wrong. As the hours stretched into days and Rebecca remained missing, the investigation shifted. Police began looking more carefully, talking to more people, paying closer attention to the people closest to her, and very quickly, their attention turned to Nathan Matthews. Nathan Matthews was not, on the surface, an obvious monster. He worked. He had a girlfriend. He lived a quiet, unremarkable life in a quiet, unremarkable part of Bristol. People who knew him described him as odd, socially awkward, sometimes intense. But odd is not dangerous. Odd is not criminal. Odd is just odd, and the world is full of odd people who never harm anyone. But investigators, as they dug deeper, began to find things that didn't fit the portrait of an ordinary young man living an ordinary life. They found that Nathan had developed an obsession, a disturbing, consuming, deeply troubling obsession with Rebecca, his stepsister, 16 years old to his 28. He had been vocal about his feelings toward her in ways that people around him had either not taken seriously or had chosen not to confront. He had made comments. He had expressed, in terms that left little room for misinterpretation, that he found her attractive, that he resented her, that something about her presence in his family's life had lodged itself in his mind in a way that he couldn't, or wouldn't, control. Shauna Hoare, his girlfriend, knew. She had heard the comments. She had seen the obsession up close. And rather than distance herself from it, rather than confront it or report it or do any of the things that a person might reasonably do when the person they love begins to fixate on a teenage girl, she stayed. She accommodated. She became, investigators would eventually argue, complicit. What happened inside that house on the morning of February 19th has never been fully reconstructed. The exact sequence of events, how Rebecca came to be in Nathan's presence, what was said, what was done, is known only to the two people responsible, and neither of them has ever told the complete truth. What is known is the outcome, and the outcome is almost unbearable to describe. Rebecca Watts was murdered. She was suffocated, and then, in an act of calculated, deliberate brutality that went far beyond the crime itself, her body was dismembered. Nathan Matthews and Shauna Hoare cut her body into pieces and packed them into bags. They hid those bags. They concealed them with a thoroughness that spoke not of panic, but of planning, of cold, methodical thinking in the aftermath of something horrific. And then they went home, and they waited, while Rebecca's family posted appeals on social media, while her father and stepmother went on television pleading for information, begging anyone who knew anything to come forward, while the neighborhood put up missing posters and people knocked on doors and search parties walked the streets of Bristol calling her name. Nathan Matthews attended the press conferences. He stood beside Darren and Angie. He looked at the cameras. He expressed concern. He performed grief in front of the people whose daughter he had murdered and whose family he had destroyed from the inside. That detail, and I want you to sit with it for a moment because it matters, that detail is the thing that separates cases like this from ordinary crime. It is not just the violence, it is the performance that follows it, the ability to stand in front of a camera and produce tears and concern and the appearance of a worried stepbrother while knowing exactly where Rebecca was, while knowing exactly what he had done to her. That is not passion, that is not impulse, that is something colder, something that requires a capacity for deception that most people cannot fully comprehend. If this case is getting under your skin, and it should, hit that like button. It helps more people find stories that actually deserve to be told. Now, back to the investigation, because what police found next changed everything. 11 days after Rebecca disappeared on March 2, 2015, police searched a property connected to Nathan Matthews, and in bags, concealed, carefully packed, deliberately hidden, they found her remains. The discovery confirmed what investigators had already begun to suspect. This was not a missing person case. It had never been a missing person case. From the moment Rebecca walked out of her bedroom on that February morning, she was already gone. The arrest of Nathan Matthews and Shauna Hoare followed quickly. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Forensic evidence, digital evidence, the bags themselves, the location of the remains, the timeline that placed them at the scene. When police interviewed them, a picture emerged that was, even by the standards of a case that had already exceeded most people's capacity for horror, deeply disturbing. Nathan Matthews, investigators concluded, had gone to the family home that morning with the intention of abducting Rebecca. His stated motive, insofar as a motive can be attached to something this incomprehensible, was the obsession. The fixation that had been building for years, that the people around him had seen and not confronted, that had grown in the silence of its own unaddressed darkness until it became something that could not be contained. Shauna Hoare's precise role in the events of that morning has been one of the most debated aspects of the case. She maintained throughout the investigation and trial that she had not been present during the murder itself, that she had been asleep, that she had known nothing until it was already done. The jury did not fully accept this account, but neither did they convict her of murder. She was convicted of manslaughter and of assisting an offender in the concealment of Rebecca's body. Whether that verdict reflects the full truth of what happened inside that house on February 19th is something that people who followed the case closely have argued about ever since. The trial of Nathan Matthews and Shauna Hoare began in October 2015 at Bristol Crown Court. It lasted several weeks. The evidence presented was, by any measure, devastating. Forensic detail that the courtroom absorbed in the particular silence that attends the worst kinds of testimony. The kind of silence where people stop taking notes and just listen, because the human mind needs a moment to process what it's being asked to accept. Nathan Matthews pleaded guilty to murder on the first day of the trial. He offered no explanation, no statement, just a guilty plea, entered quietly, without drama, as though the admission of what he had done was the least remarkable thing about him. Shauna Hoare pleaded not guilty to murder. She was convicted of manslaughter. In November 2015, Nathan Matthews was sentenced to a minimum of 25 years in prison. Shauna Hoare received 17 years. Darren Watts, Rebecca's father, sat in that courtroom through all of it. He heard the evidence, he heard the verdict, he heard the sentence. And then he walked out of Bristol Crown Court and back into a world that no longer contained his daughter. A world that had been permanently, irreversibly altered on a Thursday morning in February when he was not there to protect her. Angie Matthews, Nathan's mother, Darren's wife, lost both a stepdaughter and a son on the same day. Her son was the person who had destroyed her family, the person she had raised, the person she had brought into a home that had trusted him. There is no framework adequate to that. There is no language that covers it. It is simply one of the most devastating positions a human being can find themselves in, and she found herself in it through no fault of her own. Let's talk about what this case reveals. Because beyond the horror of the crime itself, beyond the violence and the concealment and the performance of grief, there are things here that are worth examining carefully. Things that apply not just to this case, but to the way we think about danger and proximity and the people we choose to trust. Nathan Matthews had shown signs, not subtle, ambiguous signs, explicit ones. He had been vocal about his feelings toward Rebecca in ways that people around him had registered and then, for whatever reason, not acted on. Whether they dismissed it as bluster, as dark humor, as the kind of thing people say without meaning, the result was the same. The warnings were there. They were visible. And they were not enough to prevent what happened. This is uncomfortable to sit with. It implies a shared responsibility that nobody wants to accept, because accepting it means acknowledging that the people closest to a predator sometimes have the information needed to stop them and don't, not because they're complicit, not because they're evil, but because human beings are extraordinarily reluctant to believe that the person sitting across the dinner table is capable of the worst thing imaginable. We want monsters to look like monsters. We want them to announce themselves. We want the warning signs to be unmistakable, unambiguous, impossible to miss. They almost never are. Nathan Matthews looked like an awkward young man with a difficult personality. He looked like a stepbrother who hadn't entirely adjusted to a blended family. He looked from the outside like a problem, not a predator. And that gap between what he appeared to be and what he actually was is the space in which Rebecca Watts lost her life. Rebecca Watts would have been in her late 20s now. She would have finished school, probably. Built something for herself, a career, a life, the kind of ordinary future that 16-year-olds take for granted because the alternative is too dark to contemplate. She didn't get any of it. She got 16 years and a February morning and a family that has spent every day since trying to find a way to live inside the aftermath of something that should never have happened. Her father has spoken publicly about her since the trial, about who she was, Not just what happened to her, but who she was. Her laugh, her loyalty to her friends. The way she moved through the world with the particular confidence of a teenager who is still figuring out who she wants to be but isn't afraid of the process. She deserved the rest of that process. She deserved to figure it out. The people who took that from her are in prison. Justice, in the legal sense, was served. The file is closed. The sentences are running. But Rebecca Watts is still 16 years old. She is still standing in a hallway in Bristol on a Thursday morning in February. And no sentence, however long, changes that. There is a question that never quite goes away with cases like this one. Not the legal question, that was answered in a Bristol courtroom in November 2015, but the human one, the one that doesn't have a verdict attached to it. How do we live in a world where this is possible, where the danger is not a stranger in the dark, but a familiar face at the breakfast table, where the person most capable of destroying a family is already inside it? The honest answer is that we don't get to resolve that question. We don't get the comfort of a clean explanation that makes it make sense. The Rebecca Watts case is not a mystery. We know what happened and who did it and how. But knowledge is not the same as understanding. And understanding in cases like this is something we have to keep reaching for, even when it keeps moving just beyond our grasp. What we can do, what we owe to Rebecca and to every victim whose story we tell, is refuse to look away, to sit with the discomfort of what these cases reveal about human nature, to resist the urge to file it away as something that happens to other people, in other families, in other lives. Because it doesn't. It happens in ordinary houses, on ordinary streets, on ordinary Thursday mornings, and the only thing that separates those mornings from every other morning is something that nobody saw coming. Rebecca Watts was 16 years old. She was funny and loyal and loved her friends, and had her whole life in front of her. Remember her for that, not just for what was done to her, for who she was before that February morning arrived and took everything away. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Tell me what you think justice really looks like in a case like this. Tell me what you think could have been done differently. I read every single one, and if you want more cases like this, cases that don't let go, the next video is right there. I'll see you in it. For Rebecca Watts, 1998-2015. 16 years old, deserved so much more.